Hello there. I'm Dr. Ken, and I'm going to talk to you today about the concept of the ancient Greek city-state, as well as some of the philosopher Plato's views on politics in his own city-state of Athens and others. This talk is specifically for a module called Ideas of the State, and those students in that module will of course have access to the notes and slides. Anyone else viewing this on YouTube will not, but in the great spirit of democratic Athens, anyone who wishes is welcome to watch this and comment on it if they want to. This is going to be a two-part video, so the first part will deal with the rise or the concept of the city-state, with the second part dealing more with Plato's views on politics. So to begin with, I want to talk about city-states because this is a very important phase in the development of political institutions and even concepts or ideas of the state, as the module's name suggests. And it's a very old political entity, the city-state. It's probably one of the oldest there is beyond that of the family, the tribe, and the village. Most, if not all, ancient civilizations began as city-states, and those that became larger or became empires then progressed to dominate or control other city-states around them, subordinating them. So I'm talking about things like the Babylonian Empire, the Egyptian Empire, the various empires in Samaria and the Near East. We're not going to talk about them so much, except that they also began as city-states, like the Greek ones as well. So what defines a city-state? Well, in the modern world, we tend to define them as being a city that is a state. So there are only about three that actually qualify, and that's the Vatican City specifically, and Singapore and Monaco. There are some others that are more like the ancient city-states, and I think we call them micro-states today, but Andorra, San Marino, are good examples of these. Danzig as well, between the Polish and German border for a time. And there have been many city-states throughout European history and beyond. So what these have in common with the ancient city-states is an urban center and a wider territory around that urban center, usually consisting of farmland, but also maybe villages and other smaller urban units as well. And these can vary quite considerably in size. Some were quite large. Athens and Sparta were amongst the larger of the city-states in ancient Greece, and some were quite small. And one of the recommended readings for this is this book, Polis, by Mogens Herman Hansen. There we go. Polis is the ancient Greek word for city-state. It's also the origin of our word for politics. And and that's a very excellent source. It goes through much of the history in much greater detail than I've got time to do here, or that our notes do as well. So if you are interested in the city-state, that's one I highly recommend, along with the other readings that I've put up in the notes. So how did city-states develop? Well, out of the Bronze Age, there were palace-building cultures, the Minoans and the Mycenaeans in the Greek world. The Mycenaean Greeks are the Greeks of Homer, so Achilles and Hector and those famous characters preserved in the literary works of Homer derived from that period. These cultures built palaces, and the palaces in the Mycenaean period anyway were fortified and then later dominated the regions around them. And those usually went to form as sort of the nuclei of later city-states. It's certainly the case in Athens. So the Acropolis, the Acropolis, means high city, city in the air. That hill was at one point the fortified palace of a Mycenaean city-state that then advanced, to turn into the city, the metropolis that was classical Athens. And each city-state is independent. It's got its own sovereignty, its own constitution, even, or different type of constitution, its own self-rule. It might control or dominate an area around it. We call these hegemonies, and then later leagues as well. And they're the building blocks in many respects of later of larger political entities. So, what kind of governments did these city-states have? Well, in the Bronze Age up until, in what we call the Archaic Age, so from about Bronze Age ends around the 12th century BC. From that period to about 800 as well, we tend to find kingship as the dominant form of government, so monarchy of some type or another. But from the Archaic Age onwards, oligarchy tends to be the more dominant type of government. And what is oligarchy? It literally means rule by the few. So they seem to have supplanted kings with groups of nobles or leading citizens, the wealthiest, the most powerful, who would control a city-state at the time. A few retain their monarchies, others incline more towards a democratic style of government. And I'll be talking about a couple of those in a moment. From the sort of end of the Archaic Age into the beginning of the Classical period, and we're talking 7th to 6th century or so BC, we find a rise in tyrannies. And what distinguishes a tyranny? And again, I'm specifically talking about Greece. Other parts of the world differ. But in Greece, we find a rise of tyrannies, and what separates that from monarchy? We might not say a lot, but it is actually quite significant. A tyranny is usually where someone has seized power, often from a ruling oligarchy, illegally or extra-constitutionally, and then rules like a monarch. In some cases, the tyrannies would, over time, become legitimate monarchies, but in most cases not, and often the tyrannies would be overthrown. But that appears to have been a very violent period of upheavals, political upheavals in Greek society, so 7th to 6th century BC. It's around that time as well, towards the end of that period, that Athens begins to develop some of its democratic institutions in response to the political and social turmoil that's going on. We're not clear on all the details of what's happening politically in Greece at the time. It seems to have to do partly with the tyrannies themselves, but also partly with economic changes, the use of currency for the first time in Western history, which then creates a wealth gap and leads to some social issues that result in political upheaval. So we'll have a look at two of the major city-states that existed in Greece, and of course there were many more, and we don't know as much about all the others as we'd like to. We know the most about Athens and Sparta, and I'll talk about Sparta first of all. This is again in the notes and the slides which the students in this class can follow. My apologies for anyone else who's watching this, but at any rate. So, classical Sparta. Sparta is an unusual city-state in many respects, and I don't have time to go into all the details of why Sparta is unusual, except that it is. It began also as a Mycenaean center, although the population of Sparta was largely made up of a group called the Dorians, who migrated into Greece from Europe, or from the north at any rate, and came to supplant the existing Mycenaean population. Although some of them survived, they were reduced to second-class citizen status. And Sparta seems to have had a monarchy throughout most of its history. At some point it becomes a duarchy, so there are actually two kings. The story goes that the royal household had twins, and rather than give it to the first one out of the womb, they divided the kingship between them. Sparta also has an oligarchy. It's got a mixed constitution, at least in the classical period. So the two kings sit on a council called the Gerousia, which is made up of elder statesmen in Sparta, and that council has the supreme authority. The kings have two votes, but they're in many respects constitutional monarchs, checked in their powers by the Gerousia. There's an assembly in Sparta. Their actual powers, though, seem to be quite limited. They seem to have had the right to either agree by popular acclaim with decisions made by the Gerousia, or if they chose to disagree, to remain silent. We don't know if this was called the Appella. The assembly was called the Appella. We don't know if the assembly had any real power, apart from just a kind of way of informing the citizens of what the government had decided, but they did exist. Sparta was also a society that was very top down. The citizens were an elite. They were barred from engaging in either earning money through commerce or mercantile activity or crafts. Though they owned farms from which their income derived, they mainly served in the military. And this is partly, we don't again know all the details of how this came to pass, although the story goes that Sparta began to subjugate its surrounding territory and ended up with such a huge population of slaves that it was necessary to to turn the citizens into super soldiers, in effect, to keep that population under control. And this applied to the women as well as the men. So Spartan women were also trained in fighting and horsemanship, etc., to keep the slaves under control. Um, and like I say, it's got a mixed and most city states, well, all city states in the ancient Greek world depended on slavery. This is an agrarian economy we're talking about, and manual labor is required in large numbers to sustain that economy. So yeah. Now, in the case of Sparta, as we'll see when we get to Athens, they're a very large city-state, and their dominance extends beyond the territory of just Sparta. It's got a large territory in and of itself, but then a number of other smaller city-states are sort of satellites of it. And eventually, in fact, when Sparta wins the Peloponnesian Wars in the 5th century, into the 5th century, they will form a kind of empire as well out of their league, which starts off as a league that's a group of city-states coming together in an alliance, usually for self-defense or in times of war. But in the case of Sparta, as would also be the case with Athens, that league became an empire. And these are, again, steps towards larger political entities. So when we get to the 4th century with the Kingdom of Macedon, for example, it is what we'd call an empire state, which is what Rome is as well, and indeed what the Persian Empire, which the Greeks will conquer in the 4th century, was too. And an empire state, I'll save that mostly for next time, but it has to do with one dominant city-state taking over a lot of other territories and formerly independent states and binding them together into a larger political entity. But these sort of developments are already happening, had already happened as well. I mean, the Persian Empire is an excellent example, and I'll talk about it for next week for the Empire State lecture. But the model was there, and the Greeks are beginning to imitate it. And I wanted to talk about Athens as well, alongside Sparta, because Athens, of course, would be the great rival of Sparta. Whereas Sparta was, as I say, a mixed constitution of oligarchy and monarchy, or duarchy, with its unusual dual kingship. Athens went the other direction. They had kings in their distant past. At some point, the last king of Athens, well, the legend goes that Codrus, the last king of Athens, sacrificed himself in response to an oracle that predicted if he were to die in a war with the Spartans, as it turns out, then the Spartans would lose. He sacrifices himself, provokes the Spartans to attack and kill him, and Athens wins the war. And it was considered that no other king would ever be as noble as Codrus, so there should be no kings after him. That's the legend. Did it really happen like that? Probably not. But what we do know is that at some point they give up their kings, and it's an oligarchic council made up of aristocrats who control Athens for much of its history, up to about the end of the 6th century BC, during that period of political upheavals that I mentioned. And part of the upshot of that is a political reformer named Solon is given supreme power of the state and begins instituting democratic reforms in Athens. And they aren't terribly democratic by modern standards at that point, or even by later Athenian standards. But what he does allow is, or what he creates, is a system of judicial appeals, because formerly judicial decisions were rendered by magistrates who were aristocrats, and there was no appeal. He allows an appeal to a court of the people, and this is a major step towards greater democracy, because any citizen theoretically above a certain property class, and then not just the rich, can serve on those juries, and so that takes away quite a bit of power from the aristocrats. He also admits the lowest property class into the assembly as well. So from the time, and there's actually a brief period where democratic Athens gets taken over by a tyranny, by a tyrant by the name of Pisistratus, who was by all accounts actually quite a benevolent ruler. But his sons get overthrown when they take over the kingdom, and it gets replaced with a democratic form of government. In the 5th century, that undergoes a number of radical reforms. The Spartans certainly think of it as quite radical, where you've got an assembly that is all powerful, that is the ultimate sort of source of law. There's an upper and lower house in the assembly, and then elected positions of power, but also positions of power chosen by lot, and open to all citizens. So we have, and it's a direct democracy. All citizens of Athens are members of the assembly, and it is worth pointing out it is just male citizens above a certain age. Women did not have the franchise, unfortunately. But it's a direct democracy. They all go to the assembly. So the assembly could consist of upwards of 6,000 or more people, and they decide the law. Now, like Sparta, Athens has its sort of satellite states and allies, and whereas Sparta tended to promote oligarchic or monarchical forms of government in its subject states or its allies, Athens promoted democracy. So the two sides were coming to a conflict, and they would have a war, a long war called the Peloponnesian War that lasted for quite some time. But Athens develops its own empire, what starts out as a league of allies, set up originally to prevent the Persians from reinvading. The Persians had invaded at the beginning of the 5th century. The Greeks came all together, and kicked them out. Much to the surprise of everyone, because the Persians were the largest and most powerful empire in the world at the time. And Athens develops a kind of defensive league of other city-states that come together under its banner or umbrella to defend against the Persians. But what starts off as a defensive league ends up as an empire, with Athens taking tribute from all of these different city-states. And in some cases, when the city-states aren't happy about being with Athens or allied with them, Athens goes in with its military and makes them stay in the league. So again, like I say, steps towards the larger political entities that we think of today. But what I haven't mentioned, or what I didn't mention, is that we think of Greece today as a country. Hellas is the Greek word for it. In the ancient world, Hellas just referred to the region. So you've got literally hundreds of city-states with different customs, different approaches to religion, although all worshiping the same gods, but different sort of emphasis on different ones. Even different dialects in different parts of the country, though they all speak some form of Greek. It's not unified in any sense of the word, and won't be until the kingdom of Macedon later unifies them by force. And even then, that falls apart. So I mentioned Athens and its league because they show how a city-state can progress from being. Athens was quite a large city. Its population, we reckon at its height, was somewhere around 300,000 people. That's not all of them living in the city itself. Some would live in the surrounding hinterland or territory. Quite a few would, but that size, also being the head of a trading empire, Athens had a major port. They still have a major port to this day, and trade was what helped to establish those political ties with other city-states that would eventually form the basis of their larger empire, or the greater Athens, if you like. So in a nutshell, those are the ancient Greek city-states and how they worked. It's several other factors worth pointing out. It's a much smaller world, a bigger world, I should say, in ancient times, with no internet and no mass communication, and travel being limited by how far you can walk in a day, or how far you can ride a horse. With all these different city-states, there had to be political diplomatic dealings with them. And how did this work? Well, not all city-states would have necessarily used ambassadors, but most did. And these were called prozinoi, which means something like for foreign things. And a prozinos, an ambassador, would live in. They might actually grow up in the city that they're going to represent their home city, so they would learn the customs of it. So a Spartan prozinos living in Athens would grow up there and learn about Athenian customs, but also learn about Spartan customs as well. He'd still be Spartan, but to be able to sort of bridge the gap between those two worlds. And there must have been literally thousands of these ambassadors with all the different city-states having to carry on these diplomatic relations. And bear in mind that the Greeks, apart from the short period of time when they fought the Persians as a single group, they were mostly at war with each other in various leagues or alliances, and that necessitated a lot of diplomatic activity. So it must have been quite hectic, but it also required them to develop, the essential political skills to deal with their own governments, in whatever form, but also to deal with the governments of other city-states. And this is probably why I think it's like a hothouse of political developments that a lot of things that we take for granted today get their birth or their nascence in classical Greece and classical Athens in particular. Some might say the city-state is a dead end, as a political, a step on the political evolution. The nation-state is perhaps the ultimate goal of that, although there are some also who predict that the future might consist of more and more city-states, more regions becoming kind of autonomous along the classical model of an urban center with a hinterland or territory around it under its control. Pardon me, you can already see that to some extent even in existing nation-states. Most European countries, for example, have a large capital, and then the area around it largely exists to, in some cases, the whole nation exists to serve that capital. Some would argue that London, the city of London, is not unlike a city-state in that regard. And of course, in the ancient world, city-states could be the hub of empires, and were, both before and after the time of the ancient Greeks. And some would argue that's a bit problematic because the needs of the city-state might not necessarily be the same as the needs of some of their subject territories, and that can create conflict and cause regions to want to seek their independence. But that's enough on the city-state for now. I'm going to end part one, and then I'll start part two in a moment, which talks about Plato's views on politics, and particularly in his own city of Athens. So thank you very much for your attention.